My name is John Mackey, and I'm the Executive Director of the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. So thank you all for coming on this really gorgeous May day. I'll be very brief. I'm really thankful that Angela Hawken and her team from the Swift Certain Fair Resource Center here is to come talk to you about a real exciting body of work in corrections, in the courts, in custodial corrections. And what's most exciting about their work is that it's not, they're here today not to talk about theory and research, but about kind of where theory meets practice, and really how practice can help inform theory and how theory can help inform practice. So she's brought a team of people who've to do just that, people who've worked in the courts, in probation, parole, inside prisons, to help all of you, both at the webinar and here today, get a practical feel for how these principles can help improve outcomes. So let me just quickly thank my real incredible staff at the Authority for helping put this together, and let's get going. Angela?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I had what was for sure the best slice of pizza last night, and I'm very grateful for that. I also hear this is the nicest day of the year in Chicago, so I think we timed our trip beautifully. Just to begin, I'd also like to say a few thank yous. First of all, to my team. A few of my team are here with me today. I direct the Swift Certain Fair Resource Center on behalf of the U.S. Department of Justice, but couldn't do that without my co-director, Jonathan Kulik, who is also here. Also Dan Pacholke, who is a fresh member of the team, and Ellen Schweiger, who helps us keep things on track. But more important, really, than our team, which is a team that's based out of a university, is that even though we have practitioners as part of our team, peers out there in the field who are doing incredible work pushing the envelope forward for criminal justice across the country are much better able to connect with their peer partners in other states than any of us are who are operating ourselves out of a university. So we're extremely grateful, and I think with the support of the Department of Justice, to have an amazing group of what we call peer partners, our peer professionals, who are on the front lines doing the same sorts of work that all of you are doing every day. When we think about conversations about any set of new ideas, having a judge speak with a judge is so much more powerful than having me speak with a judge, or a probation chief, or someone who's running parole. So I'm really grateful for the group of those who are sharing this experience with us today. Just a shout out to them. We have Sonia from Ohio, and as you'll hear today, we think Ohio right now on the community side is really at the cutting edge as we look around the country of where we will learn so much about community corrections and the power of shaping behavior. So we're delighted to have Ohio with us today. We have Ton and Anna from Washington. What they bring is probably the richest set of experiences from anywhere in the country, because this is the state that rolled out Swift Certain Fair statewide. It was written, the legislature passed this, and essentially they had no time at all to completely transform community corrections. I was the horrible naysayer on the side of that. I said, the sky will fall, they're moving too quickly, this is never going to work. Where's our recommendation of start small and grow? They had no choice to start small and grow. They had to do it overnight. And even though I was very pessimistic from afar, I think it took an amazing leadership team there to make that work and to make it work as well as it has. Many bumps along the way, and we really encourage them to share those challenges with you, but they managed to do an extraordinary job in implementation. And we're really delighted to have the two people who I think were most central to that effort in Washington State here with us today. We have Chris Hoy, who I always count him among my favorite practitioners. He, at the time, was running probation and is now running everything in Clackamas County, Oregon. And why we love having Chris with us is because it was the one site that really nearly imploded. Things went horribly wrong. And to listen to his story about how they kind of got it together and how we managed to learn from them about how to really get people properly engaged in this. And we really learned about a lot of mistakes that we had made along the way. And I think that's a lesson we'll bring to our engagement with you, is don't tell anybody what to do. It's a really bad idea. Don't give them a 10-point checklist of what to do and tell them to implement. Start by listening. Every place is different. Every jurisdiction has strengths and every jurisdiction has challenges. And if we come in with a model and slam it on top of something that's really already working well, we could end up displacing something that's really good. But if we start by listening and really engaging and work in a true partnership with the jurisdiction, we can learn how to integrate these principles into their existing operations. And that was the fundamental lesson we learned in Oregon, and something we will never forget about as we engage with other states in this area of work. So we're delighted to have Chris with us, who can share his experience about really turning the ship around in Clackamas, Oregon. Judge Brennan, who is not, he's under the weather, so we'll give him some slack if he is operating with subpar performance today, but he joins us from Massachusetts, and Judge Brennan was one of the judges involved in the Department of Justice rollout of what was called the Demonstration Field Experiment. Judge Brennan is among our favorite judges for many reasons, not only because we love him in court. He has a personality as well as a set of principles that work extremely well, I think, with his caseload. But he's also extremely personable and generous with people outside of his state, and has been a really amazing peer partner for us as we pair him with other jurisdictions. Bringing it local, we are delighted that we have Judge Portman with us today to share her experience with implementation of her Hope Court right here in Illinois, and also John Greenlees, who's the public defender, also from Cook County. So delighted to have them with us today. And then, of course, more than anybody, we are thrilled to have all of you here because, this is where the conversation begins. And more so that, we can share with you some principles of this model, but more than anything, I think this forum gives us an opportunity to learn from you so that we can begin to figure out how might these ideas, if they were to be implemented well in your own jurisdictions. We also would like to just give a shout out to the folks on the webinar who are coming in. We don't see you, but we know you're there. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope that we'll have an opportunity to engage with you all more directly as this unfolds. So that's it. I think before we get started, I just want to reiterate the idea here is that this is a conversation, not a lecture. We'd like to open the conversation around these ideas of swiftness, certainty, and fairness, and tell you what you will not get from our team is a how-to booklet. We think that's a very damaging place to start. Instead, what you'll receive from our team is a lot of people who have had a great deal of experience implementing these sorts of models under very different circumstances, have learned a lot along the way. And what you'll find from us is a group that is very enthusiastic about listening to the realities of your jurisdiction and figuring out how we might weave some of these principles into what you're doing already. Community corrections in this country, about 7 million individuals are somehow under the authority of some criminal justice authority, under some criminal justice supervision. And all the data we know from our national household surveys show us that a sizable share of all of the drug use in our country, a sizable share of those drugs is consumed by people who have some interaction with the criminal justice system, which means that our criminal justice agencies have a lot of responsibility for managing our entire drug problem. So it really makes probation and parole departments on the front lines of really dealing with drug use across the country more generally, which is a lot of responsibility. The problem is, if you look at how budgets are allocated, most of our probation and parole slices within any budget are relatively small compared with the corrections budget. So resources are relatively high, relatively slim. The other problem we have is that if we look at data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, in spite of many well-intended ideas, and actually some really good ideas, what we've found over time is if we look at returns to custody or the percentage of people who successfully complete probation or parole, there's been very little movement in that number, in spite of, I think, many of us who are working really hard on the front ends of reform. And a lot of this is because of this resource allocation problem. Probation and parole agencies have massively large caseloads, often very little by way of supervision resources, very little in terms of other service resources available, so drug treatment resources or other services available. And we tend to have this problem is that we have so many people to deal with, and then a set of rules that are relatively unclear. We often have, and you might notice, looking at a list of probation and parole conditions, and I look at these routinely, it really does take a law degree to understand what the rules of the game are. I've noticed, I'm recently working with a prison in Pennsylvania, and they gave me the prison orientation, the rules while you're in prison, and it honestly looked like a telephone book. For those of you who are too young, a telephone book was the book that they used to give us, and they're really thick. And the problem when you have that much paperwork is that people can't consume they don't even know what's really important to you. They can't consume the big ideas. So we start with this really long list of rules, and the list of rules is so long, and we have so many people on supervision that we can't possibly begin to monitor compliance with those rules. So we don't. So we have this long list of rules. The rules themselves are unclear, and many violations aren't even monitored. And even if they are monitored, even if there is those violations tend to not be responded to. Where I come from, Los Angeles, it typically takes, north of 10, usually 15, 16 violations for any response to happen. So most of the behavior just goes along unchecked. And that sends a signal that violating is okay. There's just no consequence for violating. And that's a very poor signal to be sending. And even if those violations are detected, they often aren't sanctioned. And even if those violations are monitored, detected, and a sanction is given, the sanction tends to be extremely delayed. It's not untypical in many jurisdictions for the sanction to follow about 2 months after the time of the negative behavior. Now you can imagine, for those of you who have kids, I have a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I have a teenager too, and I know myself, if the consequence and the behavior are so far removed, it really doesn't reinforce why you're being punished. And what happens when these are such sporadic responses and such delayed responses, when that punishment is ultimately delivered, it's on you, the probation officer or the judge, rather than on the individual. They feel it's unfair and arbitrary, and they don't even remember that they're being punished because of their own behavior. So we really lose an opportunity for shaping behavior, tying consequences to behavior, and it just seemed to be unfair. So what is Swift, Certain, Fair? Swift, Certain, Fair was a program that was really designed to try to address this challenge. The fact that we have lots of people on community supervision, many violations go unresponded to, and often the signal is just that it's unfair, because when some sanction is delivered, it's, well, why am I being sanctioned? If in the system of arbitrary responses, why am I now the one that's being sought out to be punished? So the change here is really that there's a much shorter list of responsibilities, and it might be the case that you still have that telephone guide that you hand out, but there should be a very clear articulation about the behaviors that you really are going to focus on, the things that you care about most. And I think it's really important for every jurisdiction to figure out what are the behaviors you're most concerned about, and how can we make sure that we really prioritize responses to those behaviors. And that really might vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But within this, there's really close monitoring. Decide what you care about and then actually monitor it. If you're concerned about drug use, make sure you monitor drug use closely, and that might mean random drug testing. Within the model, there are swift and certain responses. And swiftness, I think we can all agree what that means. Let's just see how we can reconfigure our system to respond quickly when a negative behavior that we want to address is noticed. And that does mean working with jurisdictions to figure out how can we change paperwork, how can we change relationships between the key players, how can we move things along so that we're responding within a day rather than within a month or two. And we've worked very closely with jurisdictions now in dozens of states to help them reconfigure their systems to deliver that speed. We also then have a model here that's based on certainty of responses. And we think this is really central to the idea of fairness, but also in terms of shaping behavior. A system should be predictable, so that if somebody does something, they know what they can expect of you. And what that certainty is something that every jurisdiction needs to decide for themselves. You don't have to have the certain responses that Hawaii has, or Oregon has, or Massachusetts has. As a jurisdiction, you have to decide, well, what is it that I'm going to deliver with certainty? And that what is it is something that the jurisdictions themselves need to decide. Or what is it that I'm going to respond to with certainty? Maybe certain actions we consider violation worthy, but others less so. We have an alternative process for those. Modest sanctions are really central to this model, and modest will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In some jurisdictions, a week in jail is modest. In other jurisdictions, 2 days in jail is modest. And in other jurisdictions, 2 hours in a holding cell is modest, because it depends on where you're starting out. So modest is something that is completely on the table for discussion in deciding how to shape a response around swift, certain, fair. But central to all of this is the idea that there should be procedural fairness and procedural justice. That is, everybody is being put on fair notice what the rules of the game are. Everybody is told at the outset that we want you to succeed on this program, and this is how we're going to help you to succeed. And everybody on this program is being treated fairly and the same, no matter where you are, no matter what you look like, No matter what your history is, if you violate these terms, this is the consequence. And the sense of fairness, which we really like to really reinforce that message, is when we talk about the orientation hearings later, is to do those in groups so that everybody can look around the room and say, wow, I'm not being singled out here. This is just a new way of doing business, and we're all being treated the same. The modest sanction, just to come back to that, is also very important for many reasons. If you have a stiff response, a draconian response to a behavior, it's very difficult to deliver on your threats. If you're promising lots of time or you're threatening lots of time, your probation officers and your parole agents are going to be much less likely to want to write up that violation. Or you're not going to have the capacity to deliver on that threat. So in terms of a model that's based on credibility, keeping those responses small. Now we're talking about technical violations. If someone's hurting somebody or doing something more serious, clearly there's a different type of response. But for the technical violations, keeping the responses to those consistent, but modest enough so that you can trust your staff to deliver on them every time. And that really does require a small dose of punishment. All right, so if we think about a way, and I mentioned to you, we're not going to hand you a 12-step process for delivering this model, but this is essentially what these models tend to look like when we see implementations. The first version of this that has probably still got the most name recognition was a model that was introduced by a judge in Hawaii, Judge Stephen Alm. And his frustration was he was new to the bench and he saw people being brought into court before him with long lists of violations, and probation officers were coming before him with motions to revoke probation. And often it would be on the 16th episode of methamphetamine use, he'd see the probationer in court with his motion to revoke. And the judge would say, well, why is it that the response was nothing, 15 years in prison? Because that's what they were looking at in Hawaii, really long underlying terms. If they revoked probation, the sentences underlying could be 5, some of them were facing 10, 15 years. So the judge was saying, well, why is it that we do nothing until we pull the rug from underneath them and then we put them away for a really long time? How do we break that cycle? And at the time in Hawaii, that really was the only 2 options that a probation officer had. The probation officer could do talk therapy, cajoling. Don't use, let's maybe think about services, but don't use. Or they could take them back to the judge, but only if they were filing a motion to revoke probation. So those were the 2 extremes. And clearly those are 2 extremes that are too extreme. If the probation officer knows that what's coming here is a motion to revoke probation and a 5-year sentence, they're much less likely to take it back to the judge. So instead, they keep talking. And probationers very quickly learn that there's a very limited chance, a very slim chance that anything's really going to happen. And so if I've managed to get away with my first 12 positive methamphetamine test, I'll take my chances on getting away with my 13th. And that was the cycle he was trying to break. And he invented this idea, which we really have started to carry over to other parts of the country, is this idea of motion to modify probation rather than revoke probation, which gave the court an opportunity to deliver a sanction that was brought to them from probation, but with a very small dose of punishment. And it didn't sever the probation experience. Once they were released from their punishment, whether it was in custody or in a holding cell for a few hours, whatever the sanction was, they would resume their probation experience. But the idea also was to make sure that when the program was laid out to parolees or probationers, that that the threats made, and I don't even like the language of threats, that the rules that were described to them were credible. They actually intended to follow through on it. And this is really the centrality to this model is the idea of credibility. That if you don't have the capacity to follow through on what you're saying, or if you don't intend to follow through, this is a really bad choice of model. Because once folks realize you're just kidding, and a lot of what we see with probation and parole across the country is really a bluff. Long list of conditions, no one's ever going to look at them, and mostly you can violate them and nothing will happen, and once in a while something will happen. And the idea here is to change the bluff, to remove the bluff and instead instill credibility. There is a formal orientation, and when we see this delivered through a probation model where a judge, for example, might deliver the formal hearing, or if it's done on parole where we have a hearings officer or some supervisor or even a parole officer delivering that session, it really has some gravitas to it, right? There's a sense of this is important. We're coming together to share with you our understanding of what we think might help you to succeed. And with most of we actually look at the transcripts of these hearings from across the country, and in most of the implementations, we see the very first sentence, which is, everybody in this room wants you to succeed. And those are the first words spoken in those sessions, and then the rules follow. Because the individuals implementing this really do believe that if there's a clear set of rules and a clear understanding and follow through on those rules, that it does help move behavior in a more positive direction. The challenge then, and this is easier to describe, right? It's swift, it's certain, it's fair, easy peasy, lemon squeezy, no big deal. Well, actually, there's a huge deal, right? And the huge deal is that we have to actually do this now. And we've already started having conversations in the room how many challenges there are here to just reconfiguring the system to get that speed, right? And the speed is important. I messed up now, there's a consequence now. Whatever the consequence is, we can figure that out. But I messed up now, there's a consequence now. And I can reinforce that over and over and over again because I can keep delivering on that threat. Again, I use the word threat. I have to strike that from my vocabulary. Keep responding to that to change that behavior. But you have to have the system retooled and reconfigured. So everybody has to be at the table. So this truly is a collaborative model of a new sort. If this is a probation implementation, you have to have a judge willing to lead this effort. Good relationships with probation. Probation officers who trust the judge to do the right thing in court. You have to have law enforcement, because the one way this can really break down is if someone just decides they're going to blow in the wind. Law enforcement is really to respond and bring them back in so that you can reinforce the message of disappearing is not a good idea, and we had a really small dose of punishment planned for you if you'd done the right thing, but now it's escalating. Because you chose to run away, we have to escalate this sanction. But the probationers or the parolees have to believe you when you say, if you do the right thing, even if you've made a boo-boo, if you do the right thing, there will be a very slight dose of punishment. But if you choose to do the wrong thing after making a misstep, it's going to escalate. So we as a team really talk about the idea of relative versus absolute. And that sounds like academia. Let me tell you what I mean by that. What we notice right now is that the actual punishment doesn't seem to matter much. So whether a judge is giving a week in jail, 4 days in jail, 3 days in jail, a day in jail, a couple of hours in a holding cell, doesn't seem to make all that much of a difference. But what does matter is relative responses. So if someone's doing the right thing, they've made a mistake, but they make the next good decision, reward them for that good decision. Make sure their response is really low dose. But if they've made a misstep, and then compound that by making other bad decisions like absconding, the response has to be stiffer. And we can talk about what that might mean. And that might mean different things for different places. But they have to know that they can rely on you. They can rely on you to give them a very small dose of punishment if they've made good choices following a misstep. And that they can rely on you to be leaning in and responding a little bit more aggressively if they haven't responded well to that misstep. And we really like that because it really puts it on them, right? How we're going to respond is entirely up to them. They get to own it. And they know because you've told them in advance. So those rules are very clear. If drug use is an issue, and not in many jurisdictions we work with, this is a central challenge for probation and parole, we tend to see sites implementing a system of regular random drug testing. So they put on notice that they're going to be tested. And at the beginning, there might be relatively frequent tests. Some sites are up to 6 times a month. Others go a couple of tests a month. But they also should be put on very clear notice that our testing policy isn't arbitrary. We're testing to make sure that you are able to desist from drug use or that you get the treatment that you need. And if you're testing positive, we're going to lean in. We're going to keep testing you at a relatively high rate. But if you demonstrate through your behavior, you own this, and through your behavior, you show us that you're able to test negative, we lean back very quickly. Testing frequency steps down substantially. Every couple of months, step it back, step it back, step it back, until you're off the hotline entirely. We like to make the response be centered completely around their own demonstrated behavior and let them know that their supervision experience is entirely up to them. We'll lean back, give them much more freedom, have limited involvement in their lives, but if they're showing that they're having challenges, we're going to lean in and we're going to wrap ourselves around them. And that means more supervision, as well as more service provision. And the service provision absolutely follows the demonstrated behavior. Every violation, but I say every violation you've chosen to consider a violation within this model is responded to. And the responses really have to be immediate. And by immediate, what we mean by immediate is also open for discussion. In some jurisdictions, it really is right away. In other jurisdictions, that sanction might kick in the following day. But we really do want to see a very small amount of space between the negative behavior and the consequence to really reinforce the idea. This is happening not because we're mad at you, but it's because of what you just did right now. And again, we're going to give you a very small dose of punishment just so that you get the idea. And let's get you right back on track towards some positive behavior change. We're also starting to see some nice innovation across the country in terms of integrating incentives and rewards into this model. For example, the original judge in Hawaii, now at the time of the orientation hearing, the warning hearing in his open court, he'll tell his probationers, if you comply with the terms of this model and you can demonstrate to me that you can succeed in the community, I'm going to dramatically cut the term of your supervision. So in Hawaii, probation terms tend to be quite long. 5 years is typical. And on that day, he'll say, if you're facing a 5-year term, if you can show me a year or two, it's usually 2 years of compliance, I'll terminate your probation. So they get to shave 60% off of their supervision term if they're in compliance. A few minor missteps along the way are usually overlooked. So folks know that there's always an incentive to get this right because they can remove themselves entirely from supervision. The other kind of minimal reward in this is just, or the incentive is just the opportunity to step people down of the caseload, of the hotline, coming in less frequently for drug tests, and also changing their supervision experience. So they have to check in less often, and they can earn more and more freedom based on their own demonstrated compliance. So what is the evidence behind this model? I know we are a team of practitioners as well as researchers and are always very conservative in our assessments of where things are at. At this point, I'd say we think this model has a lot of promise, but there's still so much to be learned, which is why whenever we engage a new jurisdiction, we really think of this as another opportunity to learn. The first real evaluation that got the attention of this HOPE approach, or the Swift, Certain, Fair approach, was the evaluation that was funded by the US Department of Justice and a foundation that started in 2007 in Hawaii. That was a randomized control trial. Their population, it was focused on high risk, mostly methamphetamine users. Hawaii, the drug of choice by far, is methamphetamine. So these were high risk. These are the folks that the probation officers had determined were at the highest risk of failing probation, and they were also methamphetamine users. Those group of individuals were randomized into 2 conditions. The one condition received Swift, Certain, Fair supervision, and the other condition received probation as usual. Many people were involved in this test. Judges, there were 10 10 judges involved. There were prosecutors, public defenders. The sheriff's office was involved, Hawaii PD. We even had the marshals going out for folks who really were absconding and blowing in the wind. They even got their relationships with the marshals to go out there and bring folks in. And central to this also was the drug treatment providers. A very strong relationship developed between the court, probation, and the service providers, who ultimately, it's interesting to watch that unfold. Ultimately, at the end, I think the biggest supporters of this approach in Hawaii right now are the drug treatment providers. They tend to find that people are coming to their sessions ready to listen, and knowing that they have the support of the court has been really, really helpful in the drug treatment experience. This has since been implemented. We had this study from Hawaii, and I'll show you the outcomes in a bit. We finished that evaluation, and everyone thought, well, isn't that cute? Nice little study implemented in Hawaii. That's great. But it's freaking Hawaii, so who cares, right? Everybody's nice in Hawaii. Have you been to Hawaii? I mean, it's in the air. What we had to remind them is that the control group were also in Hawaii and had gone on to just do really having many more challenges in the community. But so very quickly it was important that we test this approach in other settings, and very quickly the idea moved to the mainland. The first round of this, we started to see evaluations bubble up from other states. We had Alaska, Delaware, Kentucky, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Texas, Washington, and then one mystery state. Some researchers put out an evaluation but wouldn't actually name the state, so state mystery. Maybe it's you. And we see these evaluations, and I think you always want to be very cautious when we interpret this sort of research. These evaluations really are of varying quality, and it turns out that some will show glowing results, and I think we want to be really cautious about interpreting those. Look at the research designs, and sometimes they're not especially strong. But by and large, certainly Washington State's just released through Washington State University an evaluation of their statewide effort, which showed really nice-looking results. Texas had really good findings. Pennsylvania and Michigan all coming out with really good results. Kentucky has had the biggest effect. In other words, this paid the biggest dividends in Kentucky, but there were some weaknesses to that design. But certainly that implementation is looking very strong also. The Department of Justice funded what's called the Demonstration Field Experiment, which will come out probably early next year, which is really a pure replication of the HOPE model in 4 different states. And I think we've learned a lot from that evaluation, including don't ever purely replicate anything from anywhere else in any other state. Every place is different, and you have to listen first and then design a model, not the other way around. And I think the Department of Justice learned a lot from that through our work with these states, and we certainly as a technical assistance team learned a lot from that state. So if you ever take a meeting with us, you'll notice we listen first, and then we engage. I think that was really good for all of us to know. And we also see varying degrees of fidelity and implementation. And by fidelity, we don't mean fidelity to some original model in Hawaii, but fidelity to what they say their model is. Some jurisdictions have a version of what they think practice should be. Have you noticed that? There's the paperwork that says what you do, and then there's what you actually do. And there's often a lot of daylight in between, and we've noticed that too. There's these models that are on paper, and then how they're actually implemented. And our job is to work with the jurisdiction to say, well, why do I notice your data shows that you're doing nothing like your paperwork says? And there could be a couple of things going on. And what we usually find is it's not because someone's lazy or someone's trying to sabotage something. Usually what we find is if it's not implemented well, it's because the implementation strategy was not the right one. Everybody's cheating for a reason. And maybe you have to look at your design, and maybe it's time to retool. So we're working very closely with states to say, what is fidelity to this model? Why is it deviating? Is it deviating because you have terrible staff? Usually that's not the answer. The staff are usually deviating for a very good reason, and it's time to listen to them and retool. In terms of the randomized control trial outcomes from that initial evaluation, this is where I think the HOPE version of this did get quite a bit of attention. So the left column there is the HOPE probationers. Remember, these were all high-risk, methamphetamine-involved individuals. The right-hand side were the same kind of people, just randomized to a control group of probation as usual. And what you'll notice is first is the no-show rate. Those who were on the routine business-as-usual model were much more likely to just not show up for an appointment. Look at the next line. This is positive tests. You can tell we really picked the right people for this study. This is the percent of drug tests that were positive. Now, the control group had 1 month notice of the date that they would be tested. It was routine office visit, 1 month notice. They tested positive half the time with 1 month notice. The HOPE group were tested randomly 6 times a month. And you can tell that they really managed to suppress their drug use, right? They really got drug use rate way down. The revocation rate was halved for the HOPE group. And even though this was a model when they made a misstep in the beginning, it's usually 2 or 3 days in custody. Even with every sanction being responded to that way, overall, there was much less use of incarceration for this population. And the reason is they were much less likely to be revoked and returned to prison. And also, if the judge was putting them in jail, rather than going for 6 weeks or 6 months, they were going for a couple of nights. And you can put a lot of people into custody for 2 nights versus 1 or 2 for 6 months and show a savings on the jail side. But that said, that was that version that worked for Hawaii, a jail-based approach. We're seeing innovations now, and you'll hear from Sonia from Ohio, a state that is really so far ahead of the field, I think, in terms of experimenting with non-jail sanctions. So how can we respond to this and correct misbehavior without putting people into jail in the first place? So we're going to learn a lot from the front lines of innovation from Sonia today. Behavioral triage was one of the outcomes we hadn't really expected going into this, and it was a result that popped out, and I think this is becoming very consequential for our work as well as other researchers in the field. And the idea, I use the term behavioral triage to explain this. I think we really need to do more of looking at people's behavior and then deciding what to do based on their own behavior. And what we noticed, this is all coming in, everybody in this would have had would have tested high on ASI, they would have all have been screened into treatment. And the model changes the treatment side a little bit. Everybody who's on probation in the model gets the question, would you like treatment? And if the answer is yes, they don't have to wait in line, they go to treatment. Just go. We'll get assessed, get the right placement, move you in as quickly as possible. You go to treatment. But if you tell me that you don't need treatment, I'm willing to believe you as long as you can demonstrate that to me through your own behavior. And if you can demonstrate that to me for your own behavior, I'll let you be. And then you watch their drug tests. If their drug tests are negative, you never have to send them to treatment. They're showing you through their own behavior that they can do this. If they aren't testing negative, then they are showing you through their own behavior that they need help, and you lean in quickly and you give them everything that they need. But what was really interesting is in this population of high-risk methamphetamine users, 80% of them never tested positive were tested positive 3 or fewer times. Look at this. Half of them never tested positive again in the 1-year follow-up period when they were in this credible model, when they knew if they used, there was going to be a consequence and it was going to be immediately. In a system like Hawaii's and in most places, there's a limited set of drug treatment resources available. There's never enough money for treatment. And in an atmosphere of never having enough money for treatment, you have to figure out how you're going to use your treatment resources, right? What we find in my state, for example, everybody gets mandated to treatment and there's a treatment requirement under our laws. Everybody ends up getting a little bit of nothing. And the people with serious problems never get enough. So when we divide our treatment resources across everybody ends up not getting quite what they need. Some people are over-treated. People who actually don't have a diagnosable substance use disorder are put into treatment who don't belong there. And there's really great research showing that's a terrible idea. You can do harm by putting people into treatment who don't belong there. And for the people who really do belong there, who aren't getting enough of it, that failure to match treatment problem is a huge disservice to them also. So we really need a better approach of figuring out who needs to be where. And this is one example of how to do that. It's not the only way to do it, but it's another option of how to do that. Half of them never tested positive, so they didn't get a cent of drug treatment resources spent on them. The money was moved over to the right-hand side, people who really needed much more intensive and high-quality care. And the result is, if you're on that far right-hand side now, you're testing positive 3, 4, 5, 6 times, you're getting every resource the state can put to you. We see lots of people in residential treatment for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year in Hawaii, because for the first time they can afford to do it because they're not treating everybody. They're figuring out who really needs to be there. Again, anybody can raise their hand and say, I want drug treatment at any time and get it. But otherwise, their behavior gets to dictate who's going to go and who's going to be mandated, who's going to be court referred or referred through the agency to receive that treatment. This is going to look a little academic, but bear with me here. The red bars here it shows us the probabilities, so how likely you were to get a probation violation, to be sanctioned, if you had committed a probation violation in Hawaii. So this is probation as usual. Notice, and this tells us if they were on their first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth probation violation. Notice that they have to get to probation violation number 7 to even have a double-digit chance of being violated. There's only 11% likelihood of being violated if you're on number 7. You can see how long you have to do, how many misbehaviors you have to have before any action is taken. The blue bars are the hope group. Notice that they're much more likely to have a violation, but it's not perfect. You can see there's a little deviation from the model there, right? So in Hawaii, we had to look at this data and say, okay, well, swift, certain means absolutely. There's no certain here. I mean, it's much better than probation as usual, but not certain. And we started to listen to the words of the probation officers. And this is where the magic is. Listen, they know a lot. And what you hear from them in the responses to this is, I know I'm supposed to violate somebody for being 25 minutes late to an office appointment, but this person's doing really well. And I won't do that. And when we hear that over and over again, we realize this model needs to be adjusted to take in the perspectives of the probation officers and figure out how do we handle something where it's a very small misstep. Is there another approach to addressing that behavior? And they've started moving into the different direction of there is a sanction, but it's not going to be jail time if you're 20 minutes late for your appointment and you've otherwise done really well in probation in recent history. So we're starting to see these responses that will allow probation officers to actually implement the model with fidelity because it's a model that resonates and seems fair to them. When the model isn't fair, no one's going to play by the rules. What we found, we've just finished a 7-year follow-up long-term evaluation of those people who are put into the HOPE program versus business as usual from the beginning. What we see is even 7 years later, a 50% reduction in drug charges. That's a big difference 7 years out, right? Because they were well beyond the active period of the program. We did see, this is interesting, relatively small changes in other charges. They were lower for the hope group, but not huge. In other words, you get a 50% reduction in drug use, but the property crimes didn't wiggle as much. And that gets us scratching our heads thinking, well, we have to think, the lives we live are much more complicated potentially, and it might be that we really are getting a criminally involved population that's criminally predisposed that are also using drugs here. And that when we solve the drug piece, we still have a lot of criminal involvement. And so I think what this means is that we're just beginning to think about solutions to problems. We can never stop. We can never be complacent, because even though the drug use side is nicely suppressed, there's still other negative behaviors. And I think what this really shows is that you get the behavior you're targeting. So in the HOPE model in Hawaii, they were very persistent on drug use. They monitored the drug use, responded to drug use very well. And they saw the benefit of that. If you can figure out what is the behavior you're trying to change and really target your programming around that, that seems the direction to go. Nice result for Hawaii, they saw a 50% reduction in returns to prison for that group. So they were much less likely to be revoked and sent to prison. Something that we also did as part of that was we tracked people. I mentioned to you that one of the incentives under this program, the judge announced in court that they would be terminated early if they were doing well, usually after 2 years, sometimes a little quicker. They'd be removed from probation. So one of the questions we had, well, what happened to those early terminations? I mean, once they were liberated from supervision, did they go off and do all sorts of terrible things? That's an obvious question. And we tracked every single one of those cases. There were about 100 of them when we finished the study. Not a single one of them had a new encounter with criminal justice. In other words, someone who was closely monitored and was able to show you for a couple of years that they were really able to comply was a pretty good bet. And the question now is, why would we want to waste any supervision resources on them? Let's move them off the caseload and focus instead on those individuals who are having trouble. It'll be very interesting to see in jurisdictions that have shorter supervision terms if the same thing applies, if after 1 year or after 6 months we have the same response, if that result will hold. Something that was really important, and the legislature in Hawaii had us looking at this data very closely, is we found no difference in implementation or outcomes by race ethnicity. You were treated exactly the same no matter what your age was or your race ethnicity was, and that's very unusual. If we look at data for other sorts of programs, we do tend to see these race ethnic differences. We also found no difference in the outcomes and implementation just did not vary. And I think that is central to the idea of fairness of this model. We have to be looking for models where the system is created. It's kind of an autopilot in a way that doesn't allow people to interject those differences even if they want to. It's kind of a model that kind of requires that everybody is treated equivalently. Swift and Fair has since expanded. The Department of Justice has been involved in some of this, but sometimes states have just taken this on their own and taken this into whatever direction they see fit. We saw the first version of this implemented with Anna and Ton in a high-risk parolee population in Seattle. It was called WISP, Washington Intensive Supervision Parole. Very nice outcomes there. The truth is that study involved a super A team. The parole agent was phenomenal. Everybody, the hearings officer was phenomenal. So we had this kind of cherry-picked A team, but it gave proof of concept, gave an opportunity to see an implementation that was working in parole. That really informed what later became the rollout of Washington. Washington State's rollout wasn't exactly the same as that implementation, but shared many of the essential features. And they were the first state to roll this out statewide. We then saw applications for juveniles. 2 counties in Arizona have implemented juvenile versions of this model. It's now been extended to pre-trial in Hawaii, so that's bringing on a different population. And we now see prison applications actually in 3 states. I need to update this. The 3 states are Washington, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania probably is now in very quick order will have the largest number of these implementations in custody. And the idea there was to reduce the use of segregation, have very swift and certain responses to negative behavior, but to find a punishment that made sense for the inmates. We often tend to design punishments for ourselves rather than the people whose behavior we're trying to affect. Like, for example, I know if you told me I was going to go to segregation for 30 days, I wouldn't want that, so I'd shape my behavior. Well, not everybody's going to have their behavior shaped by that threat. So what they did in Washington, and we're seeing in other states right now, was this idea of figure out what that person cares about. And it turns out in Washington State, what that person cares about is his sneakers. So if it's a violation and you take his sneakers away for 2 weeks, that's much more compelling and drives outcomes much more so than the threat of segregation. We've seen huge differences in outcomes in Washington State when they started to really figure out what is salient to an inmate and what is kind of a very strategic strategy for shaping their behavior. And we've just seen the data from Pennsylvania, their swift, certain, fair custody implementation too. If someone has a negative behavior, they respond very quickly, the doses are very small, they've significantly reduced their referrals to segregation as a result. So this model in some form, the swift, certain, fair implementation that's really retooled for the needs of any jurisdiction, is now implemented in city-states as well as the first tribal implementation, which is also in Washington, within the boundaries of Washington State. We've seen the statewide rollouts now in Washington and the pilots that will inform a statewide rollout in Alaska and also Michigan. Michigan has the largest number of court implementations of this model. There's also been federal and international interest. We've had visits from Japan. The Australians are looking very closely at this model now, as well as potentially an implementation in the United Kingdom. In terms of generalizability, I think we all have to be very careful. We have to be careful to draw lessons from Hawaii or from Washington or Massachusetts into our own version of the model and be very mindful we have our own staff, our own philosophy, our own inmates or probationers or parolees, and what's going to work here at home. So I think if you ever think about integrating these ideas into your own systems, to just let it be the starting point for a conversation. But in general, we've definitely noticed that what really matters is what is business as usual. So this is an approach that's going to pay dividends depending on what business as usual looks like and how you might layer it in to business as usual. In Washington, for example, you could very quickly save jail days by focusing on drug use because the prosecutor's offices there are very aggressive about pursuing drug charges. So if you have a control group business as usual that's going away on drug charges or being aggressively pursued, if you can reduce drug use, you're going to have savings. In some jurisdictions, the prosecutor, and I think Washington's a good example of that, the prosecutor's offices are much more kind of, drug use, okay. They're just not filing those charges, and they're not nearly as aggressive, so you might not find that kind of drug use saving there. Even if you get the behavior under control, it might not show in your convictions data or your drug arrest data because they're just not pushing them as hard. So a lot depends on local circumstances. That was interesting watching the Washington experience just in terms of the returns to swiftness, particularly if you're in kind of a parole application. It was taking them before their swift, certain, fair weeks, a long period of time for them to see a hearings officer for a sanction to be delivered. So you had all that jail time while they were just waiting to hear what their sanction was. And I often say this, and this is very unfair, if in Washington State, if the intervention was a Tootsie Roll, they would have had jail savings. Because what they did was they sped it up. They got people in front of a hearings officer very quickly within a couple of days. So by making it a couple of days rather than a couple of weeks, you immediately shave off a bunch of jail time, and that's what they were able to do there. So I think thinking about the savings just to swiftness, irrespective of what your response is on the programming side or the sanction side, just speeding up there's a lot of savings right there. The Department of Justice has supported many rounds. They supported the demonstration field experiment. There's now implementations in round 2 and round 3 all over the country. I'd like to just point 2 out. And we were supposed to be here a few weeks ago, and then it got busy in Chicago and was cancelled. I'll just call that it got busy, right? Actually, I don't even know how that turned out. I hope it turned out well for everybody. But we were bumped because of that. And we had in our initial panel, we included a team from New York, which is another site, I think, if you ever have time to visit, to do. This is a parole application, and they really have, it's called Reset, and that stands for something, I think they very work backwards to get the words that work for Reset, but I think philosophically what it really is resetting parole. It was just thinking about the parole experience fundamentally differently. They integrated the ideas of swiftness, certainty, and fairness, but they layered on so much more to make the parole experience really quite different from what it was before. I'll look at our website. We've got details of that, and I'm so sorry they won't be here today to share their experience, but it's a program that's absolutely worth seeing. The other state I'd like to draw attention to is Ohio, and I talk about them as being on the cutting edge of this sort of model, or at least experimentation. What we like about Ohio is we're always interested in places that are willing to try something new. Even when we talk about fidelity to the model, I had a conversation with someone last week, or this week even, when they were talking about fidelity to the original Hope model, and they wanted to make sure there wasn't a deviation from fidelity to that model. And I said, there was high fidelity to the horse and cart. High fidelity to the horse and cart. Do we want to stop there? Aren't you glad that there were innovators saying that horse and cart is working really well? We're getting to the store and we're getting home, but let's keep moving forward. The problems we're dealing with are so rich and so serious, we have to keep trying. And what I love about Ohio is that this is a state that by luck and by chance and by local circumstances and need was forced into this era of pushing this model in a new direction. There are 4 implementations in Ohio. 3 of them involve no custody, and you'll hear later today from Sonia. We are waiting anxiously as our research team to figure out what exactly that has meant for the state of Ohio. We can learn, maybe we can get some hint from Sonia today. But seeing versions of this and folks that are ready to innovate has been the most exciting from our perspective. I think the time is right. I think circumstances are so dire in so many jurisdictions that we just have to try, and often that means trying something new. The Department of Justice funded our resource center. We are fully funded by federal money, and our mandate there is to work with any jurisdiction that is interested in implementing this sort of approach. And the nice thing about it is that none of us are making money on this. All of our services are 0 cost to states. In fact, all of the programming our centers deliver throughout unit, everything is done at no cost. So what that does is it allows us to have an opportunity to really engage states, listen carefully. Because we're not selling anything, we have no commercial interest in it working or not working. We really just want to troubleshoot. Let's figure out how to get this implementation working well for you. We're now also integrated into the Violence Reduction Network, trying to get some of these ideas of swift responses, listening carefully to individuals, and really retooling approaches to supervision. I think there's still many unknowns. As I think about where we scratch our head now, and certainly as we're going to learn from the Ohio experience, is what is the optimal sanction? If you think we do so much because it's an accident of history, right? We've just always been doing it this way. But if we're to start from scratch and say, well, what is the right way to shape behavior, or what is the optimal response? I don't think we know. I really don't think. We just kind of take it as given, right? Someone wrote it down somewhere, and once it was written down, it became a thing, and now we have this thing. We don't know. So I really think we're going to find a lot of experimentation around this idea of, what is the right response to a certain set of circumstances? And I have to say, the language of, and I learned this from a previous secretary in Washington, is sanctions are powerful. They're so powerful that we can really do less of them. And I think we have to learn from that. And what we're trying as a team to figure out is, well, how low can we go without losing it? So if you step down from 2 days to 1 night, 2 nights to 1 night, is that okay? And so far, that looks to hold pretty well. But as we step down from 1 night to a couple of hours, do we still have the same behavior response, or do we have to ratchet it back up? So as a team now, we're really interested in this idea of testing different sanction strategies to figure out what is the smallest dose we can give but still get attention. Because punishment is expensive. It's expensive to give out, and the human costs are serious also. And we have to be very mindful of the human costs as well as the fiscal costs of that sort of strategy. As a team, we're really interested in also figuring out how else we can integrate rewards and a richer set of rewards into the model, because we do know from the literature that rewards can be very powerful, and we're only starting to learn more about those sorts of exercises and doing that. But from our team, I think something we're going to be pushing out this year, and I'm very excited to do this work, is the F of SCF. Swift, certain, fair. Swift, we can all agree on what that means. Swift means just do it in a hurry. Quicker the better. Certainty, we can all agree on. It's whatever you decide you're going to respond to, just be certain, be predictable. Let them know this is what you're going to do. But the F, oh my goodness, what does that mean? None of us are going to agree on that. That depends so much on where you are, so much on your worldview. What we're really hoping to do is start the conversation about fairness and get everybody in the room to inform that conversation. Bring in the judges, the prosecutors, the public defenders, the inmates, the probationers, the parolees, and their families. And let's really have a richer conversation around these issues. And that should be jurisdiction to jurisdiction, because place matters, and every place is different. And the idea of what's fair will change from place to place. That's it from me. I'm going to take any questions. I don't even know if I have any time. I'll take questions if there are any questions right now, and I think we're going to have a break and come back to listen to the people who should be here. I have no business standing up here. I've never put cuffs on anybody. I've never sentenced someone to anything. So really what I would like to do is clear the stage and bring up the people who are really the experts in this, the folks who are on the front lines of delivering this. I think we've put together a cadre of amazing humans for you to listen to. Thank you.